All right. Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And we're back with the continuing on with my David Kemball-Cook series, where he was a former biblical Unitarian and now he's apostatized. He's no longer a believer, although he does believe in God in some kind of a loose sense. So, welcome back to the show, first of all, David KC. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent. What have you been up to since the last time you were on the show? I know it's been a couple months there.
I've been working, of course. I teach in two schools, teach mathematics, and I've been studying and thinking. I've been reading about German philosophy recently and critical theory, postmodernism, studying that, reading actually 3 books on that. Very interesting stuff. And interesting to me, incidentally, to hear how 2 kind of heroes of mine, Pine Creek and Mr. Deity, seem to have gone different ways on the postmodernist workist thing, which has been a bit interesting to follow.
Interesting.
Yes.
Awesome.
So yeah. Anyway, yeah. So
Awesome.
it's good. Life is good.
Great. All right, cool. So on the other side, we have an atheist joining us who's no stranger to the show, David Johnson. Hello, David.
Hello, all.
Welcome back. Welcome back. It's been a long time since you've been on the show, but I know you're.
It's like it's been days.
At least, yeah. So yeah, I guess just for your, I know that you had a show this morning or something. You want to tell the audience what that was about?
Sure, I had Eric Bickernick. He is an author. He's writing. He's written his second book in a series, and he's going to start working on his third book. It's a sci-fi kind of not aliens, conspiracy theory, satire. Look, you just have to hear the show, get to know the guy. We had some very interesting conversation about the crossover between religion and strange theories, and turns out there's a little bit of crossover. So there was some conversation there. skepticsandseekers.com, skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. So you can find the shows there, or find us under 4S or Skeptics and Seekers under your favorite podcatcher of choice.
Awesome. And joining me on the Christian side, everybody's favorite Yankee Doodle, David Russell. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, buddy, how you doing? How's life in Canada?
Yeah, can't complain. Just did a show this morning with Jamie Castro and Marvin Wallace on transgenderism and the LGBT. Wow. So,
yeah. So, is it cold up there?
Not really. It's kind of warm and foggy and rainy.
Really? Yeah, we got it was like 80 degrees yesterday down here.
It's insane. Yeah,
it's crazy. And David Johnson, it's always good to see you. And Mr. David Kemball-Cook, lovely to see you again as well.
Hi, thank you.
Awesome. And just before I turn it over to David Casey to give his presentation on what his issues are regarding David Hume and miracles, Mr. Russell, you guys have your show every Friday night. So what did you guys do last night?
That was Cosmic Corner, and that was Josh's program. I didn't participate. I've been taking care of people with flus and stuff like that. So we've been working on that. So
fair enough. Well, you're ready to go today. So awesome. So
no, I'm completely unprepared. So I'm waiting to see what David's got to say.
You know what? So am I, because I was planning to prepare for this show on Thursday and Friday, but my internet wasn't, it was down. So I couldn't do the prep. So yeah, we're both going to kind of wing it today, but thankfully, David KC, you've got a presentation to show us. So yeah, I'll turn it over to you to make your.
Okay, right. Thank you. Yes. So we I think we had a little show in October, didn't we, where we talked about the resurrection, and I came to the conclusion there that
just not to interrupt, are you sharing your slides?
No, not yet. I will do in just 20 seconds.
Okay,
I can start now. All right. So Right, so I'm just got my PowerPoint up. And how do I share? Just remind me. Present.
So under present, then
Then
share screen,
share screen.
and
Okay.
then go to entire screen. I do just to make it
Okay.
easier.
Okay. Entire
And,
screen.
and then
Yeah.
click on the little image. It'll get a blue border around it.
Okay.
And then click share.
Okay.
All right. And then go to your slides. Okay, perfect. So they're up now.
Okay. Right. So yes, we were talking last time you had a show with me about miracles, about the resurrection rather, and I came to the conclusion in that show that we must be agnostic or skeptical about Jesus' resurrection, unless we're reasoning from a faith point of view. But if we're reasoning as an unbiased, rational thinker, we should be skeptical. And then we had a look at some of your shows as well, Dale, about Hume and about miracles.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the light of that, I wrote a couple of comments on your show, really trying to take up what you were saying about Hume, and also thinking again about repeating the points I tried to make in that last show. So you invited me back on just to talk about miracles rather than the resurrection in particular, generally miracles. So as I said, I have just some brief points to make. And the first one is about Hume's general statement against miracles, which we're going to look at. Yep.
If you don't mind, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I don't usually do that, but just so you know, Gary Habermas has actually just published a week and a half ago his volume 1 of his magnum opus on the resurrection, and he has me listed as somebody influencing. So I definitely go and buy his book. It is a great book from what I've seen. So I just wanted to promote that, and
so let me just interject on top of that, because when you asked me what I was up to, you asked about the one that I was on today, but the one that's airing today is Matt and I discussing Gary Habermas's book, as he did a recent show, a recent debate, and so we were going over that debate, and so that's actually the show that's going to be airing this weekend. So I thought I would include that.
Thanks for that. Yes, awesome. I saw Sean McDowell's interview with Gary Habermas, which was last week, I think, and that was about 2.5 hours long, I think, was it? Something like that. And then Paul Ogier did a show on that, which was about 20 minutes. and I think he would say that he demolished Gary Habermas's text. But anyway, in 20 minutes. But we could talk about that a bit later on, if you like. That would be interesting. So shall I continue here? So we've got Hume's general argument against miracles. I want to talk about probabilities about the past, and then we could bring in Bayes' theorem. And I know that Dale, you like to use Bayes' theorem, and I do as well. I think it's a very useful tool. And then a general point about miracles that are alleged to have happened long ago, and conclusions. So here we are. This is the statement that you quoted and that I quoted. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. And Dale, you, I think, attempted to refute this, and I would like, but I didn't quite follow your refutation. So when I finish, perhaps we could go to this and you could explain that a bit more. But I think it's common sense, and I would say we all of us agree that people who've been dead for over a day do not usually come to life, and we'd normally require very strong evidence for a resurrection to prefer it over any naturalistic explanation, and indeed for any miracle. We're talking generally about miracles here. We prefer, even if you're a believer in miracles, you would still need very strong evidence to believe it over some naturalistic alternative. So that's my contention here. And then if we talk about probabilities, right? So, which is what Hume is. So Hume's comparing. So David, you okay with this? And David's too, with the P meaning probability. Is that all right with you guys?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good. Continue.
Yeah. So P, and then what's in brackets, that is what's called an event, which is the thing that we're talking about the probability of. So, and P, probability, is a numerical value between 0 and 1, where 0 equals impossible and 1 equals certain. And so we're comparing two probabilities, and that's what Hume is talking about, isn't it? Either the testimony is true, probability that the testimony is true, compared to the probability that the testimony is false. And if the probability that the testimony is true is greater than the testimony is false, probability that the testimony is false, we would accept that the testimony is true. So, okay, so I hope that's fairly non-contentious, that this is what Hume is saying. But I thought, Dale, that you were trying to rubbish that. And so I commented on underneath your show page on YouTube that I gave this example here. If we take winning a lottery and call the event W that this number wins, and then assuming that there are that number of tickets, the probability that it's like 1 in 1 million, isn't it? That ticket wins. So the probability of W is 1 in a million. And then we hear testimony on the news. So we'll call T for testimony. And it's on the news that W is true. And this is not, this is a reputable news company. So it might not be Fox News. I don't know. I don't know where you are in the States and what your belief is. But over here in the UK, if it comes on the BBC news, then we kind of believe it's happened. All right, it really is true. But I know you have a lot of varied television channels in the States, so maybe if it's not on the if it's on the news, it doesn't mean it's true there. But anyway, so okay, so what Hume's saying here is that we're in equivalence. We're comparing the probability of the testimony being true with the testimony being false, aren't we? And either we're comparing the probability that I really did win the lottery, and the news reported it, with the probability that the news reported it, but I did not win the lottery. In other words, that the news was false. And I say this is common sense. This is what we would normally do. And if we see that happening, if I bought a lottery ticket and then suddenly I see on the news that won, I believe it. And because we trust the news, at least, as I said, we trust the BBC News. All right. So is what I've said on this slide reasonably clear to you guys? Do you all follow my logic? Is that, Dale, do you agree? That's the...
Yeah, so, sorry, ask that again.
Yeah, so do you follow the reasoning here?
Yeah, so I'll give my response on this after you're done your presentation.
Okay, all right, so we could go back to that, but that's the question that I put at the bottom of the show is, what's the problem with that reasoning? Okay, so moving on. Now, talking about probabilities, here's a note, is that there's a type of probability called conditional probability, which is symbolized by this slash, and in English it means given. So and R would be, for example, resurrection. So the probability of resurrection given the testimony of the resurrection, the ratio of that to the probability the resurrection did not happen given the testimony that the resurrection happened, that ratio is the same as the probability of the conjunctions. That is the probability of resurrection and testimony. In other words, testimony true, that ratio to testimony false, which is what I was talking about on the previous slide. So the ratios of these conjunctions, testimony true, probability to probability testimony false, is the same as the ratio of the conditional probabilities, the probability of resurrection or whatever, given the testimony, or compared to the probability of resurrection not happening, given the testimony. Okay, so, and I raised that because conditional probabilities is used in Bayes' theorem. But this point here, any conclusions using probabilities are subjective. And I say that because people use the word probability as if there's only one thing called probability, if there's only one kind of probability. But there are many different kinds of probability. I was last trying to count them, and with I think I got to about 7 or 8 different kinds of probability. And I teach maths at school, and so we have a subject of probability and statistics where the probabilities are defined in a very mathematically precise way. Then the probability that a fair coin yields head is a half. Probability that a die shaken yields a 6 is 1/6, and we can calculate using these mathematical models and get exact answers. So that would be a kind of objective probability. But when we're talking about the past events, the probability that Jesus rose from the dead, or that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in a theater, or that Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, these kind of events, things that happened allegedly in the past, that's a different kind of probability. And that kind of probability is a subjective opinion. That is, my probability would be different in general from yours. I mean, we might all agree that the probability that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in a theater was equal to 1. In other words, we're certain of that. But of course, we might differ certainly amongst us about the probability that Jesus rose from the dead. But what we're talking about here are subjectives. And so I have this issue with you, Dale, I think, and so many other people, is that you talk about probability as if there's just one kind of probability, you know, and all that the mathematically exact ways that we can handle it translate into talking about historical events. But really, they are just subjective opinions. So you might want to come back at me on that, but there is no single kind of probability. All right, so, and if we use Bayes' theorem, so obviously, Dale, you know all about Bayes' theorem, but you too, David, how are you? Have you heard of Bayes' theorem? Have you used it? Have you talked about it, either of you?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
We're familiar with it.
I've allowed Dale to attempt to educate me on it, and you can find the results in podcast form.
Oh yes, David Johnson. Yeah. Were you on Unbelievable about the resurrection? Was that last Easter?
It was a few Easters ago.
Was it? And was it Jonathan McClatchy?
It was.
And was he using Bayes' theorem?
He mentioned it once or two. I'm not sure he was actually using it.
No, he mentioned it quite a lot of times, and it seemed like the two of you were talking different languages, wasn't it? As I remember it.
Yeah.
And but anyway, we don't need to go into a lot of it. But I could. I mean, we could use the whiteboard here on if you've got a whiteboard, Dale, on this platform, and we could talk. You know, do a little bit of maths if we wanted to, but just briefly, Bayes' theorem brings in conditional probabilities here and enables us to, if we have probabilities before we look at data or evidence or testimony, called prior probabilities about whether the event happened or not, perhaps compared to some alternative, then it's a way, and it's a theorem, it's an exact way, mathematically valid way of calculating posterior probabilities using the probabilities that how well each hypothesis explains the evidence or the data. And it's a simple formula which is mathematically exact. And if we assumed that, for instance, that the prior probabilities are equal to a half, in other words, we have resurrection and the alternative, and they're both equal to a half, and the alternative is that there was no resurrection, but some naturalistic alternative, then we're considering the judgment of someone who's open-minded before looking at the evidence, saying, I'm prepared to believe it either way, I'll go where the evidence goes. So I'm open-minded, my prior probability of each is a half. In other words, it's 50-50. You know, I'm willing to accept where the evidence goes, and I'm rational. So I'm not going to be biased one way or the other. So if we do, and then if we use Bayes' theorem, then the ratio of the posterior probabilities, that's one divided by the other, would be equal to the ratio of the probabilities of each given the testimony. In other words, which hypothesis better explains the testimony is the one to be preferred. And that's also, you know, almost common sense, really. When historians talk about, you know, proving things happened in the past, the method of proof, as it were, is what's called inference to the best explanation, which is common sense, really. You go for the explanation that best explains the evidence, all right? And just try to be unbiased. You don't make up your mind before you look at the evidence. And then you go for the one that best explains the evidence. So do you people agree with that as a general principle, that we're the way we should approach alleged events in the past? What do you think? Or should we come back to that?
I'm happy with letting you continue. I think we're going to prepare responses at the end, I guess.
Okay, fair enough. Good. I said it. Right. Yes, so good. So in that event, then, if we agree, or you might disagree, but we'll find out, that this is a good way of proceeding with events that might or might not have happened in the past, then if we're looking at resurrection in particular, we get down to the nitty-gritty of explaining how well resurrection and its naturalistic alternative explain the testimony. So, and the testimony is documents allegedly written in the 1st century, of which no autographs survive. You know, we've got something, is it from the 3rd century? We have some of the Gospels. All right, so the next question, miracles long ago. Well, my contention, and I have moved, of course, because when you and I, David Johnson, last talked, I was a Christian believer, I think. So I have now changed my view.
Actually, you were on Red Letters once, and you had already changed your view.
I had then. Okay,
yes.
right. I was a sympathetic supporter to you then, right? Yes, I remember now. Okay, so I'm now saying that if without a faith point of view here, without prior belief, I do not close my mind to the idea of a miracle today, or last week or last month, but not for 2,000 years ago, because all we have are ancient documents. And if we look at those ancient documents, we could have a probable belief that the disciples believed in the resurrection of Jesus, but some naturalistic explanation could have grown into those stories that are reported. And again, we know that the Gospels were written some time after the events. Even the letters of Paul were perhaps 20 years after the events. And so many details could have been accrued, myths grown up, and so on. So I would say, according to my subjective probability, I would say that that a naturalistic alternative for an event, a miracle, a long time ago, is a good explains the evidence as well as a miracle. So I would say agnosticism would be the best position for an open-minded, rational person for a miracle long ago, and in particular, the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, that's mine. So stop sharing.
All right, awesome. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. So I think I managed rant back and wrote down some of the points. But before I get into
We can come back. Yeah, sure.
before I come to my counters, I just want to get the general take from the other two in the audience, just generally about Hume and miracles in a couple minutes or so. So, yeah, David Johnson, I'll start with you. What's your take on David Hume and his arguments on miracles in general?
I find it generally inoffensive. It seems intuitive. I don't want to speak philosophically because, as everyone knows, I'm not a philosopher, but I don't find anything obviously fallacious about it.
Okay, and David Russell.
Well, if I mean, I don't agree with it. I think people in his time dealt with his arguments at the time. That maybe they weren't popularized at the time, but I think his arguments are not very good. I think there's a lot of stuff that he misses. But like David Johnson said, I think it could be say that it's kind of an intuitive thing, but from a certain point of view.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So yeah. So I'll give my kind of take. So the first point that you kind of raised there, David Casey, that I would like to or understand your objection, because you seem to be agreeing with me that there are many different types of valid forms of probability, including subjective probabilities. So I always admit that. I never say there's only one type of probability. That whoever said that, I've always said that there are many types. There's a frequentist type. There are other types, including the normative or subjective type, which is also valid. And I mean, for example, if you want to deny the validity of using subjective probabilities, then you might as well just throw out all of history altogether. Unless, can you tell me the frequentist probability that a given historical event happened, that the Hittites and the Egyptians under Ramses the Great would tie that war? Like, can you calculate the number of specified outcomes divided by the number of total possible outcomes, including all the logically possible worlds where things could have been different? No historian in the world needs to calculate that when they're making a judgment about the subjective probability that, yeah, this event probably happened or this event probably didn't happen. Like what's your take on that first issue? Like, what's wrong with subjective probabilities?
Oh yeah. Well, Dale, I did not say there was anything wrong in it at all.
Okay.
But I wanted to point out that talking about the past, the probability that something happened in the past is a subjective. Basically, it's an opinion. It's an opinion.
Yeah.
And I apologize. I got from reading your notes, I really got the idea that you thought there was only one kind of probability, but I obviously missed the fact where you made it clear that you distinguish between them. But I agree. Yeah, we cannot do a frequentist analysis on events in the past. That's logical nonsense. So that's why I say, last time I counted, there were 7 or 8 different kinds. And, one of those is the mathematical probability of a 6 when you'd rather die. Another is a frequentist. And another is subjective about the present. Another would be subjective about the future. Somebody's going to win the bowl this year, whatever, So about those are opinions, but they are probability. They carry the name probability, and we can apply Bayes' theorem to them. And in fact, I really, I wanted to. I'm a skeptic on the moon landings, by the way, and the Apollo landings. And my brother is a firm believer in the moon landings, and he's always rubbished my skepticism, and so I challenged him just recently. Let's do a Bayes' theorem analysis. You pick your 3 best facts, facts, not opinions. I pick my best 3. We start with Pryor's probabilities of half, and let's agree on how well each expect we can dialogue, and let's do a proper analysis. And he said he was too busy. So he's only content to say, what about this, or what about that, or what about the photographs? But so you can do Bayes' theorem analysis on about events in the past, and it makes an interesting study. And of course, the McGrews did that on the resurrection, didn't they, in their chapter? Which, if nothing else, has spawned a lot of discussion.
Okay, so great. So we actually agree on that front then.
Yeah.
So that's great. Here's another thing that I'm hoping I can get you kind of to agree to. But so it was your last objection, that when we're looking at historical claims or miracle claims in the distant past, we just can't make that decision or something like that, and we can't prove that. And I would just want to say, well, first of all, from a Bayesian perspective, yes, we can. We don't need any kind of special type of evidence or miraculous evidence or whatever, right? As long as we have sufficient evidence on a balance of probabilities, a miracle claim is no different than any other historical claim. If we have sufficient evidence, we ought to believe and apportion our belief according to the strength or lack of strength of that evidence. So right away, you might say that, yeah, but with ancient historical miracle claims, the evidence is never sufficient to reach that point. But then, to be consistent, wouldn't you have to say the same for any historical event? Like, do you think that we can't make any conclusions about any historical event from the ancient past, or?
Yeah. So me again. I was saying in my presentation that I think we might all agree that the probability that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in a theater, whenever it was, 1867,
9, maybe 1869. I'm a Canadian, so I don't have to know.
Oh no, sorry. Yeah, okay. That we might all agree on that there's enough evidence to support that.
Okay.
So that would be what, 150 years ago, would it? Is that right?
Something like that, 200 years.
150, yeah. So not the distant past, but still in the past.
Okay.
And before the days of video evidence, certainly. So, yeah. So, and all we would have for that event would be written records.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I agree in principle, but so I'm agreeing in principle with you, but I'm saying that 150 years ago, yes, maybe we might agree that there was a miracle, certainly. And I accept your point that we, in principle, a miracle is no different from any other historical event. In principle, it's a claim that X happened, whatever X may be. But then, of course, as I said, we have to get to the nitty-gritty in any particular event about the particular evidence. And my claim is that 2,000 years ago, we've got documents of uncertain provenance, but none written down at the time of the miracle happening. And we have to consider how well that and its naturalistic alternatives explain the evidence that we have. So I'm disagreeing with you, not on principle, but on fact, on the application of the criteria to a miracle that happened 2,000 years ago, allegedly.
Okay. All right. So this was obviously one of your major points. So before I get to the third and final thing that I wanted to address, I'll bring in both the other Dave. I'm surrounded by Davids, dear goodness. I'll bring in David Russell first this time. What's your take on this issue about, ancient miracle claims? Almost by definition, like the evidence will always be so bad that it's insufficient to ever make a historical claim and conclusion.
I'm with you, Dale. I think that, you have to kind of like judge it on the merits of each case. And I would have a very, very strong disagreement with David Kimball here on how to assess historical data and how to do history, I guess, to even come with that conclusion. But I'm with you on this. I think you have to judge it on the merits of each case. I think that I've read your or even listened to your conclusions as well, and I think that you make a stronger case here. on probability and stuff, especially when it comes to the historical aspects, because we have many ways to test historicity. I mean, for David, he'd have to assume that the autographs didn't exist or weren't written by eyewitnesses. And I think we can have a substantial argument on the fact that they were probably written by the eyewitnesses or testimony of the eyewitnesses. And I know you guys will disagree with me, but I think that evidence is strongly in favor of eyewitness testimony, people that knew him, etc. So, yeah, I don't think it's very strong in that respect.
Okay, awesome. And just for the audience, David and Tyler Fowler actually did kind of discuss with David Casey the specifics about the Gospels in our last episode. So you can check that out and we'll come back to it kind of thing. But David Casey, before I go to David Johnson and get his take, just very quick question for you. Do you accept what the historians call the criteria of authenticity? Like the criterion of embarrassment, multiple independent attestation. Do you accept those criteria as a good way to glean facts from historical sources, regardless of age? Or
well, in principle, I do, but what I've read about them has suggested to me that they are not all that easy to apply, and that sometimes they point in different directions according to which criterion you're using. In other words, some criteria conflict with each other, but they're not the final determiner of whether an event happened. They can only provide a guide to thinking about an event in the past as to whether that might make an event more probable, but they're no guarantee of certainty.
Okay. All right. So
and
lastly,
just hold on. I just want a quick question of certainty here. Like, what type of certainty are you looking for?
I think again, we're all talking about the same thing here, which is our own subjective probability. As I said in my presentation, that a certain event happened. So, one man's certainty is not the same, about an event is not going to make another person certain. Yeah. It's a subjective thing.
So, like, would somebody with their certainty, their subjective certainty, be also a rational human person that is actually thinking these things through? Because I noticed in your presentation you said that if you're rational, you have to be skeptical, and I just kind of find that kind of like one-sided there. I think that somebody could be rational and come to an opposite conclusion of you and be rational in their assessment.
Yes, well, of course, because you might differ on how, if you both approach the data with open minds, you could differ on how you deal with the data.
Yeah, and I just want to get that out there, David.
Both be rational about that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to put that out there because of what you said earlier, and I just wanted to make sure the audience was clear on that as well. Just because I mean, we could. I might not have as much information as you. You might not have as much information as me, right?
Oh no, David. No, I'm talking about the same information being available to both.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's always available, but
no. That's why I was talking. My example of using Bayes' theorem on the moon landings is that we start with an agreed set of data available to us both.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it's I think it's important to be the proper word here is critical, and critical doesn't have a negative connotation. It just means, regardless of your conclusion, pro or con, two people can be critical in how they treat the evidence. They treat it reasonably in light of logical inference criteria and that sort of thing. So, but David Johnson, you've been very patient here, so my apologies. But I want to get your take on this main objection about miracle claims from recent history versus miracle claims in the distant history. Is there a difference there, or is it possible we could be just as warranted in claiming a miracle claim from the distant past versus one 150 years ago?
So you're surrounded by Davids. I'm surrounded by former hosts of SNS. And unsurprisingly, I agree. I disagree with both of you and the other David, and so we just have an interesting situation here. It's the situation I hoped we would have, really, where there's lots of disagreement. The thing that you and Russell said, and I think that you, David, agreed with, is that you have to take it on a case by case basis, claims of the past, and that it is, it's possible for resurrections and miracles and other things to happen in the past probabilistically, and so you just have to take each one and examine the evidence. I do not agree with that. That is not actually a starting point of mine, because for a thing to be just as probable in the past, it's just as probable, just as possible, at all possible, probable, is that it has to be possible. It has to be, it cannot be underneath the threshold of what is possible. So I think that part of the starting point differences between, say, a skeptic like myself and a religious person like the two of you at the top of this panel would be, I don't start with the presupposition that anything is possible. I don't believe that anything is possible. Now, given a God in miracles, anything is possible. And so you might have that leaning, that starting point that says, okay, let's consider this because it's possible. Let's look at the evidence. I don't start with anything is possible. In a world of hard physics and materialism, I am a materialist. Anything is not possible. There are many things that aren't. And so I would have to say that if a thing is most likely not possible today, and you would hear that claim and deem it not possible today, it doesn't become more likely to be possible when it's further away where it can't be examined. So the first threshold that a claim has to cross for me is, are we even talking about something that's possible? Because I'm not going to do the math when the thing is impossible to begin with.
Okay. This does relate to Hume's maxim a little bit. That's the next point I'm going to get to. But David J., let me just ask this as a quick follow-up then. So you're kind of pointing to our uniformity of experience today. And this is something that's relevant to David Hume's argument. But you're going further than that and saying, well, our uniformity of experience entails uniformity of nature all the way in the past. Obviously, so, some people have questioned that. So what, like young earthers, for example, they'll say, well, maybe the laws of nature were different in the past, or, we can't have these uniformitarian assumptions. I know that's kind of slightly off topic, but do you want to just kind of briefly mention that? Like, why should we assume uniformity of experience means uniformity of nature in the past?
I don't think it's off topic at all. I think it's a good question, but I would say that if we consider that anything is possible and that things might have been different at a different time that we can't access either historically or through physics or biology, anthropology, any of the ologies, but we just kind of make that assumption, and that's just another claim that we can't show. And at that point, I don't even see why we're doing the math. Because if anything is possible, then you can just believe anything. We can't prove it, but it's possible. And if all you want is to get me to say, well, anything is possible in a world where there are no fixed rules, agreed. I don't think that's the world we live in, though. So, yeah, I do think that everything points to, at least in our experience of humans on Earth, this small time frame, things in the past are, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same as they are today. And so we can't reasonably posit another kind of physics 2,000 years ago that doesn't exist today, and then plug that into the equation.
I'd also back Dale. I'd also back his claim up on this aspect is that he has no good reason to accept otherwise. right? I mean,
Mm.
not I mean, as far back as you could research, things were set and fixed, right? So, um,
Yeah.
he has no good reason to accept the possibility of it at all. So, and I disagree with him, obviously, but I do understand his claim perfectly well.
Yeah, and there's a theological aspect to that as well that I should have asked, but we'll move on. But I'll just mention that, for example, cessationists, they'll say, well, uniformity isn't true. Something spiritually fundamentally different. There's no longer a need for miracles, but there was during the New Testament period or something like that. So
Okay, you got
that's
me. I was a cessationist, but I was
okay.
also a crackpot. So don't hold that against me. You get
Was crackpot?
You still are a crackpot.
All right.
You can't
All right.
use my former religious beliefs against me in this argument.
Fair enough. Okay, so David Casey, I want to move on to the Hume's maxim, your main point here, and give my response. So let me make sure to, and then we can go
Dale,
to the
Dale,
yeah.
before you do, I just wanted to ask David Johnson
Sure.
something. Hi,
Yeah,
David.
go ahead.
So, thanks. So, David, you say you're a materialist, right?
Yes.
So, may I ask you, what's the basis of your belief?
Just haven't seen anything that would overturn the idea. So materialism is, I would say, personally, an intuitive notion. And I think that it's right to begin with the intuitive. But as we know, physics is not always intuitive. In fact, it's mostly not, the more you know about it. But we start with the intuitive. So we have reason to believe it. And then we are at that point looking for confirmations, which I think opinions in physics and the sciences probably favor materialism more than others. But then we go further than that and we look for evidences or claims that might overturn that idea. So yes, you have this idea and you feel like you've confirmed, but you look forward to disconfirmations. And I have listened very intently to the various attempts to disconfirm materialism, and I have genuinely found them unconvincing, even when I tried myself to hold beliefs that there was more than the material. I still found my own beliefs unconvincing as well. So that does not mean that materialism is true, but that's kind of the process by which I personally formed the belief in materialism, and I am happy to let it go and believe something else if someone could show it, but I'm not sure it's the kind of thing that could be shown.
Okay, could I come back on that?
Yeah, sure.
So yes, so you've said, David, which I welcome, is that you are open-minded. In other words, that you do not dismiss a miracle or a supernatural event out of hand, but you are prepared to look at the evidence. Is that correct?
Personally, because I used to be a believer, and I was a believer in a fundamentally, I think, different kind of world that I believe is reality today. So I can't put myself all the way back in that mindset because I have more information now. That said, I also don't think that people who believe in miracles are crazy. Right? And so I listen to lots of miracle claims. Some of them are crazy.
Okay.
Some are crazy presented by crazy people, but
Okay, so
not all of them. And I try to look at least some handful of them every year with an open mind, as open as a mind can be that fundamentally has concluded that such things don't seem possible.
okay, so then, so is it not fair to ask you what evidence would lead you to accept that a miracle had occurred?
I would actually have to see the kind of miracle that people claim to have seen. They didn't believe until they saw the miracle. So
No, okay,
I don't
well,
see why I should believe on different evidence.
no, but I'm prepared to say what I would accept, and
I could name lots and lots and lots of things, but I'm just saying whatever the miracle claim is that someone is making, if they believed on the experience of that, then at minimum, I would need that experience too. So it's not fair to ask me to believe based on
Okay,
stories
well,
of miracles as
no,
opposed
no,
to
no.
the experience of
I'm
miracles.
asking for your experience. So,
Right.
what a personal experience? Supposing that you're walking down the street in the city, and you see somebody hit by a car and dies, and obviously dead because his body he is dissected by he's torn apart, and then you see somebody coming to pray, and you see the body parts coming together, and the person coming to life again. You see that. Would that be evidence for you to accept?
Yeah, let's just assume that things like, a magician is not in town, and one of these miracles where they make the Empire State Building disappear. Let's just assume that none of that is going on. I will say yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would prefer though a personal miracle, not something that I with faulty vision saw, but something that happened to me. And so if I am walking down the street and suddenly I've levitated, and now I'm three stories up, I can speak very, very personally about that miracle, as opposed to some miracle that happened to someone else that then I have to kind of process.
Okay. Well, so your mind is not completely closed.
No, like I said, if other people can believe in miracles based on personal experience, it's not fair to ask someone else to believe based on the story of someone else's personal experience.
Okay, all right. So I'll come back to you maybe later on. Okay. Thank you, Dave. Over to you.
Mm-hmm.
No problem. No problem. So, all right. So I'm just going to share my screen. So this is the main important point for David KC on Hume's maxim here. So let me just bring that up. Slideshow. Is that showing up? Are you guys seeing?
It was Dale. Now it's completely blank.
Yeah. There it is.
There it is.
Okay. So just to kind of summarize Hume's argument here in that quote. So you can put it in premise format like this, right? Premise one, the experiential evidence for the laws of nature. So this is referring to that uniformity of our experience of the regularities in nature is much stronger than any possible testimonial evidence, which is, from the gospel evidence for the resurrection, that counts as written testimonial evidence, right? So the experiential evidence for the uniformity of nature is much stronger than testimonial evidence in favor of miracles ever could be. Premise two, we should proportion our belief to the evidence. So this is the evidentialism premise that Hume has. And then therefore, three, the evidence strongly suggests disbelieving any testimony concerning miracles. So this, in a nutshell, is kind of what in premise format summarizes David KC's quote of Hume saying, look, whenever I hear testimony about a miracle or somebody rising from the dead, I think to myself, well, what's more likely, that someone would be lying or someone would be deluded, or that somebody actually rose from the dead or this miracle happened? And he's assuming, in light of our uniform experience, that any testimonial evidence or merits, they're just going to pale in comparison by definition, because we have that uniformity of nature as our background knowledge. Now, interestingly, with what David Casey and David Johnson were just debating, Hume himself admits that we can have evidence that overwhelms this uniformity of nature. So if I have experiential evidence, non-testimonial evidence for a miracle, like if I experience someone, then you could believe. And Hume offers his own hypothetical example on that front. I forget what it is. Was it levitation? Maybe it might be levitation as his example. You can believe in that if you see it with your own eyes. But the first point that I wanted to raise here is this argument of Hume is against testimonial evidence, right? So if we have non-testimonial evidence for miracles, for example, I have scientific evidence, observations from the Shroud of Turin proving Jesus rose from the dead, then I completely bypass Hume's argument here. That said, I'm going to address this argument because I think that historically, the Gospels and New Testament literature are indeed good testimonial evidences that overwhelms the uniformity of experience in nature. And so on Bayes' theorem, so here's the form. David Kemball, I was using the odds form of Bayes' theorem. And instead of doing that, I'm going to bypass that. Instead, let's use the proper form of Bayes' theorem. This is the version that I use in my own religious research, right? So that what's the probability that the resurrection is true given the evidence and the background knowledge, relevant background knowledge and information? And in order to get that, so you have to do what's the conditional probability of having the evidence given that the resurrection hypothesis is assumed to be true times the prior probability, the intrinsic probability that the resurrection hypothesis could be true given our background information. And you have to divide that by, again, the numerator, but also consider in this aspect here that, well, what's the probability we would have the evidence given the resurrection didn't happen? And what's the prior probability that the resurrection hypothesis is false given our background knowledge? And what I was attempting to say in my show, and I should have used this formula instead of the odds to make it, I think, clear, Hume only looks at this. His argument here only proves at best, even if I grant everything that guy said, which I wouldn't, at best, he says, well, this probability is really low, extremely low. He doesn't realize, he doesn't even account that, well, maybe this probability is extremely high. Maybe the evidence, the testimony evidence is so strong, and I believe it could be in principle so strong that it overwhelms any improbabilities here. Secondly, he doesn't even take account of this part of the equation. David KC says, well, he's talking about given the background knowledge, maybe at best he's considering this option, right? Because, well, what's the prior probability of lying or being deluded? But he doesn't factor this into the equation. So David Hume lacked this Bayes' theorem. He didn't understand probability calculus. Granted, it didn't exist in his day. It came in a couple of decades after him. But he's not taking into account this full equation. If you want to know, is there sufficient evidence, and all of us here, with the possible exception of David J., have agreed that on sufficient evidence, in principle, we follow the evidence. If we can conclude that the resurrection happened, we should believe it. So you have to take into account all of these factors. Next, let's look at, is it true that this is really low, that the prior probability that the resurrection is true, given the background knowledge, the uniformity of nature? And in the first place, I would say no. And it's because we can look to the Jeffrey conditionalization formula. And I've never seen any atheists or skeptics get into this because I think they can't. So in order to assess what this is, there are all these factors. So number one, you have to understand, well, what's the prior probability that God exists given the background knowledge, right? So given all those arguments for God existing, what's the prior probability that God could exist here? And then also, well, what's the probability that the resurrection would be true given we assume God exists? And this would be 100% nearly, right? If God exists, and by God here, I'm including the fact that, and we suppose, because it's within a religious context, that he had an equally probable, there was an equally probable chance that he could have had a religious motivation for raising someone from the dead. So God exists, plus he had the proper religious motivation to raise someone from the dead. This would be 100%. So this is extremely, or if you want to be skeptical, or 99.99. This is really high. And I've never seen anyone take into account this, the divine psychology aspects, right? Then you have to add in, okay, maybe there's a probability that the resurrection happened on naturalism. I think it's virtually zero, but even if it's not zero, this still adds to the probability, right? So maybe God doesn't exist, but Jesus still rose from the dead. If you put that at 0.0001%, you still add that, and that increases the prior probability there. Times, obviously, what's the prior probability that God doesn't exist, given the background knowledge. So you have to take account of all four of these components when you're calculating that prior probability. David Hume did not. It didn't even occur to him to do that. But yeah, so maybe for time's sake, because I know we've got about 15 minutes, I think. Yeah, so David Casey, I'll start with you. Using this formula, and also my take on the Jeffrey conditionalization formula, where we have to take into account, look, we're not just asking what's the prior probability God would randomly raise a random person from the dead. No, Jesus takes place within a religious context whereby it's provably, at least a priori, equally probable that God could have had a sufficient religious motivation for raising him from the dead. And we have to take that into account. And David Hume does not. But yeah, over to you, David Kemball. What's your take on some of what I've been saying here on it?
Well, okay, Dave, my first question is, what kinds of probability are we talking about here?
Subjective, all subjective.
Subjective, right. So I tried to understand these slides, and I couldn't see any reference to where you made it clear what kind of probability you were talking. When we say the probability, then that would imply that there's only one, possible value.
Okay.
But yeah, that makes it clearer that you think it's a subjective opinion, really.
And one thing I will say, though, it's not limited to that. Like, I think that's the only thing. Like, how would you assess statistically the probability that God exists? Can you put a frequentist number? I don't think so. But
no. I think it's a different kind. As I said, I think there are 7 or 8 different kinds of probability, and the probability that a certain supernatural entity exists is a different kind of probability from anything else we've been talking about today, I think.
So you don't think it's subjective? Like what type of probability?
Well, I think it's something that, it's subjective in the sense that we have an opinion of, but it's something that, like a historical event, either this event happened or it didn't. Either there is a God or it didn't, or there isn't. So there's a subjective character to that. Whereas whether there's going to be a hurricane next week in Ottawa that's a bad example. But some things you can't pin down in an objective way as being objectively about something happening.
Okay.
But the whole, I tried to understand the slides and I couldn't. And I thought the whole idea of a religious context and how you narrow that down to Christianity, when there are numerous religions in the world, most of which hypothesize some supreme being, and only 2 of them, Judaism and Christianity, have a supreme entity whose interest might be in raising a first-century Jew from the dead. It struck me as so impossible to be able to reason with this use any kind of mathematical formula or reasoning with this, because the assumption seemed too strong.
Okay, so and before I answer that, and I will bring in the other 2 guests. So just out of curiosity, what type of, out of the 8 types of probability, what type do you think we should be applying to the Bayes formula then, if not subjective and not frequentist?
I'm dubious about applying Bayes' theorem to the probability of God existing.
Okay. So just
I can relate to using it for the certain event happened in the past, or certain event will happen in the future, or the medical examples that we have, where we use Bayes' theorem, probability of a certain individual having cancer or whatever, given a positive test. These we can argue, we can talk about evidence, but when we get into God, it's a strange thing, because metaphysically speaking, we're talking about the foundation and the structure of the universe and of the human being and of our reasoning process itself. So I think we're trying to reason behind what's supporting our reason, if you like.
Okay.
And if God exists, and I do believe there is some kind of God out there, but that it's almost a fundamental impossibility to be able to reason to this God's existence, because I think all we can have are pointers. That's all, and I don't think we can actually descend to using mathematical formulae.
Okay. So two points to respond, and after this, I will go to the other Davids to get their take. But so in the first place, you are 100% right that in terms of ontological probability, God either exists or he doesn't, right? So there's a 1 or 0, basically. That's a binary choice. So I agree. But when I'm talking about the probabilities here are epistemic, right? So it's what's the probability that we are warranted in believing God exists? That's what Bayes' theorem is really getting at, right? It's an epistemic formula. So it's the degree that we're warranted on the evidence and stuff, and on the background evidence in believing a hypothesis like God exists or Jesus rose from the dead or XYZ, whatever it is. So that's what we're talking about there. Hopefully that will clarify that. And the second thing about, you said something about like we're making assumptions, and we're not. This is a formula, right? So it's if you want to know what this probability would be, again using subjective factor, assuming subjective probabilities work, and I would argue they do. It's irrational to deny the validity of subjective probabilities. Just read the Stanford Encyclopedia on probability issues. But it's not like we're assuming. We're asking a conditional probability here. What is the probability that God would raise Jesus from the dead if he exists right here, and he had a sufficient religious motivation for doing so, right? So obviously I would say that's 100% virtually, right? But it's asking, what is that conditional? If he did have this motivation and he existed, what's the probability he would raise Jesus? But we also have the opposite here. We're also asking, well, what if God doesn't exist, and or God exists, but he doesn't have, so this covers the other religions, that he doesn't have the religious motivation for raising Jesus. So this whole process is additive, right? So it doesn't matter in terms of getting that prior probability. There's no selection bias going on here, if that makes sense. So yeah, David Russell, I'll go to you. What are your thoughts on Hume's maxim and how I've responded to it with Bayes?
I think you're right. I think that obviously it was decades later that Bayes came into play. I think you hit the nail on the head there. He didn't look at it from different varying aspects. So I mean, it's obvious there. I feel like I'm missing part of this conversation as well. Like I'm coming into it kind of blind because I don't know some of the stuff you and David Kimball talked about before. But I think one reason, and this is just, and you guys correct me if this is way off or whatever, but like there's one aspect that I think we factor into our defense of a Christian God, is that God has revealed himself, right? So we have to take that into consideration. David, I know he's like, it's, how can we comprehend what God it is and this and that? Well, that would be true if God didn't reveal himself. And the thing is, if he did reveal himself, we have to do the historical framework, because he's going to reveal himself to somebody and then multiple people later on. And it might, depending on how many times he revealed himself. And we have to assess those situations as well, along with, okay, now did he reveal himself in a very real way on the resurrection of Jesus, or Jesus coming down himself? And if God did do that, if that then it would specify a specific God, so that's what I think Christians would defend most vehemently, that God has revealed himself. And that's why we do these type of assessments to see if that's true, if that God did reveal himself. And I think the evidence for me has definitely put me in the camp of yes, he did. So that's just my
just a quick follow-up for you. And again, I get that with Bayes' formula, the only reason I'm putting this in is because that was important for David KC, and I understand he gets it and stuff. But just as a simplistic thing, just in words, like, look, it's David Hume. The argument is often given in word form, like, hey, look, how many the prior probability that God would raise someone from Jesus from the dead is 1 out of 10 trillion billion, because look at all the random peeps throughout history, and God doesn't raise them. The vast majority of people he's never raised. So the probability is like 1 out of 10 billion trillion, however many humans have died and not risen from the dead. And what I wanted to say here, that's a total misnomer, because what you have to do, it's the prior probability that God would raise Jesus from the dead, given he had a sufficient religious motivation for doing so. And if we can detect that religion authenticating context, as religions by definition carry in terms of their miracles described in their claimed inspired literature, that comes accompanied with that religion authenticating context.
I would say, if you're looking at the resurrection from a particular point of view of motivation, yes. But I would also have to say, well, there's another aspect to this. Like, Jesus also says, I lay my life down and I take it up again. So, and the whole point is, if Jesus is God, then those people raising from the dead is doesn't happen. You're right. People coming back doesn't usually happen unless God does it, or God does it himself, or either some sort of hypostatic union. And do I have good reason to believe that there is a hypostatic union? And do I trust the Gospels? And for me, it's do the Gospels warrant my belief at that point? And if they warrant my belief, why do they warrant my warrant my belief here? Like, so for me, I trust the Gospels because I think they're historically valid. I think they're historically reliable, and I think the entire Bible is a document which has stood the test of time, I guess.
Okay. The only thing I would say, so I think that's totally
So
irrelevant.
so where on a one scale, Dale, like, I agree with what you're talking about, like, exactly, right, from that point of view. But I think there's also another way you can look at it as well, or it can be incorporated even into that theory.
Okay. And I'll just clarify, and then I'll go to David Johnson to get his take, and then come back to David KC. But remember, this is just about the prior probability. So I'm not even assuming. I'm saying the prior probability should be 50% in Bayes' theorem, which means either God did have this religious motivation in Jesus' case, or he didn't, kind of thing, right? And we're not saying, if we want to say, well, yes, he did, and bring in gospel evidence or evidence for the resurrection, that's a different factor. That's that's us looking at this part of the formula, right? The evidence given the resurrection and stuff like that. But when it comes to just the prior prob, I would say this has to be 50%, at least 50% on the.
What's 50% here, Dale? The PR given B and G, or the PG given B? Which one is 50%?
The total is PR given B is 50%, at least.
Okay, but not the PG given B. What are you saying that is equal to?
The B and G?
The P of G given B, the second term in your red expression.
Yeah. So the point that I'm saying here, so I would get into my numbers are actually going to be higher if I plug in real numbers, but I'm helping out you skeptics by limiting it to just 50%, by saying that.
What is 50%, Dale? The first term, the PR given B and G.
I just told you I'm not going to assign actual numbers at this point, because it would be actually higher, but the total that I'm saying is 50%. So
the total is the total, the value of the red expression is 50%. But you don't know, you're not explaining or saying how you get that from those two terms multiplied together. You've got two numbers multiplied together equals a half. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
But you're not saying what those two numbers are.
Because I didn't calculate it out. So if I'm going to give real numbers, I'm going to wait, not here, and wait and give that, because it'll be higher than 50% if that's the case. But I gave the default to help you unbelievers out by limiting it to 50-50, because I know for a fact it's at least 50. So either the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection is true, or it's not true.
Okay, sorry, I'm interrupting a lot, but it seems to me like we're begging the question here. You're saying it's a half without telling us how you got the half, or at least a half, you're saying. And of course, David, when you come to him, will say that P of G given B is 0. So 0 times anything is 0, can never be equal to a half.
Sorry, say that again.
Well, 0 times anything is always 0, isn't it?
Yes.
So if you talk to someone who does not accept the existence of the Christian God, that PG given B is 0.
PG given B is 0%. Oh, yeah. but this is assuming that God exists, given the background knowledge, right? Where this, if you want, this would be, you could say this is 100% or something like that.
No, Dale, in that expression, you've got P, G given B.
Yes.
So I'm reading that as the probability that the Christian God exists, given the background knowledge. Is that not correct? Is that not what you mean?
Okay, so
what do you mean by that?
This is just a God, right? Real, maximally great being. Doesn't specify Christian God necessarily, but there's also this Christian authenticating context. So yeah, this would be that.
Yeah. You said that God brackets, well, I'm assuming that's the Christian context, exists. That's what you're saying. So yeah, for an atheist, PG given B equals 0.
No, but the context is there, whether even if Christianity is false, the context is still there.
Could I just give my response, and I can let you guys go back to it, because it might be helpful to know what I actually think as opposed to presuming. So yes, of course I'm an atheist, but my problem, once again, I can't speak to the maths. I can't speak to the philosophy, but I can give a kind of intuitive objection that I think others might have, which is, Dale, it seems like you've kind of cheated the prior probability by creating a tautology. And the tautology is, if the kind of God exists that has the power to do this thing that I'm claiming he does, and also if he wants to do this thing, then it's almost certain that it happened. Well, yes, of course, I would agree. But you just said that if this thing happened, then it happened. It's kind of a tautology, and you just created a thing and slid it in as prior probability. And I would disagree with that entire enterprise. If you want to say that if a God generically exists, then what is the probability of this person being resurrected? And then I would have to agree with David Kemball-Cook. There are many, many gods. Even in the Christian story, there are ideas that Jesus did not come in the flesh, or that Jesus was never crucified in actuality. So you have to, there are other possibilities. And so basically you've just said, if there's the God of the Bible, of the God of the certain type of Christianity that I believe in, and who could and had the motivation to do it, then that's, then you plug in a percentage. You just kind of created that and then put it in prior probability. I don't see how that happens, because I would not be able to make that move. And if you were just stating a more modest claim of, if a supernatural being exists, what is the prior probability? What is the probability of Jesus being raised? I would say it's still high, because the possibility of supernatural beings that we would call God is astronomical.
Yeah, so what you said doesn't really apply to this equation, right? So there's a reason I don't want to give the numbers, because I don't have it, right? So this would be 100%. And then
I'm not asking for the numbers, just to be clear.
I'm assuming this is 50%. But I mean, I did the cosmological argument, and that was at about 78%. So I can say this would actually be 78% if I were plugging in my own numbers. Plus, I have the ontological argument, plus other arguments that I haven't completed my work on and published. So that's why I don't want to give the number. But I'm cheating for you guys by limiting it to just 50-50.
I'm not asking for the numbers. I'm not That's not what I'm doing. I am saying that you have made a complete statement that involves your conclusion and put it in the probability position. And so, of course, it's going to be true because your conclusion is kind of associated with the claim. So yes, if my God exists that I believe in that would do this thing, then it's 100% that it happened. Agreed. Once again, I just questioned the efficacy of including that type of.
Well, are you saying that G includes that God, the Christian God, actually exists and did have a motivation?
Well, no, I'm saying that putting "if" in front of it, if God exists, if God exists with a power to do a resurrection, and if there is a religious context where he would want to raise this person from the dead, then, and I'm just saying that's too much to put into a prior probability for me to be able to take this on intellectually. Once again, if you had just said, if there is a God, a God being, then the probability of this event would be, and then, but of course the number would be smaller because the odds of just a generic God being with the power to raise Jesus from the dead isn't very high until you add all of the other things that you are kind of bringing on board with the argument to get a certain kind of God.
But so I'm not. Nothing. So in terms of God exists, just God exists, right? So if I have to give, I know you're not asking for my number, but it feels like I'm being forced to. So with the ontological argument, I'm 99.99 or more proven. The exact number is, I don't know, but I know for a fact it's going to be above 99.99% that this real maximum degree being exists. But then I'm going to have to multiply that by this aspect where it's detected by the religion authenticating context, right? Does God actually have this motivation to raise Jesus or not? And the default position is 50%. That means either he did or he didn't in Bayes' theorem. And I'm saying that from the evidence I've seen, there's no way to tell a priori whether, I'm not assuming the Christian God exists. I'm not assuming the Christian God does not exist. So it's 50% is the number that you would have to plug in there.
Dale, I'm sorry, I don't follow this at all. Bayes' theorem says nothing about 50%. It looks like you're saying that there must be a 50% because it's Bayes' theorem. I used 50% in my presentation because I was assuming prior probabilities of resurrection or miracle and no miracle to be equal, just for the sake of arguments, but that's just dealing with what I was talking about. You're talking about probability of God existing. I think you're saying that the probability that this God, your G that you talk about, is 50%. And I don't, is that what you're saying? I don't see where you get that from.
And he has this religious motivation. So 50%.
Okay. Where did you get the 50% from?
Great. Principle of indifference. So mathematically speaking, 50% does nothing to the Bayes' theorem calculation. Doesn't go up, doesn't go down. If you plug in 51%, it goes up by that much. If you plug in 49%, the overall calculation.
So are you saying that into a Bayes' theorem calculation, like what you've referred to, we should assume the probability the Christian God exists? I mean, Christian God, I'm using as a shorthand for your G, exists as 0.5. Is that what you're saying, as prior probability? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in a sense that this real maximum great being exists, and he did have the motivation to raise Jesus from the dead.
Right. So you say the principle of indifference, but really that's just a phrase that's saying we don't know anything, so we're just going to assume the probabilities are half because we got no information otherwise. Like when you toss a coin, say probability of a head is a half, but that just means you don't know what the wind current is going to be, etc. Is that what you're saying? Is that we just don't know anything about God, so we'll assume the probability exists as a half?
Yeah, and I have considered a few a priori arguments trying to favor and disfavor the Christian God in
Yeah,
my own research, and I just
yeah,
think that they're inconclusive. So because of that, I don't go up or down. It
okay.
stays at the default
Well,
level of 50%.
well, Dale, we've got off what I thought we were going to be talking about today, but I would really like to have another discussion with you all about this, because you've brought this in, which is really, really interesting. But we don't have the calculations on the screen for how you get, for instance, 99% for the ontological argument, and how you rule out all the other religions to get to the God that you want, and
That's
still
not a
say
part
the
of this. Okay, okay.
probabilities of half. So, but I think that's, because of the time's sake, that it's really worth another show here, isn't it? Don't you think?
It is.
Because
I just wish.
we've cut across what I was talking about, which is how we deal with evidence to miracles in the absence of faith belief. That was my original take on it. I was saying, if we don't approach the evidence with a faith belief in the existence of God, how do we get to some judgment that the probability of that a miracle happened, that we believed it? You've brought in the idea of bringing in a prior on the existence of God, which is a different kind of assumption from what I was talking about. So I hope everyone gets that what you're talking about here really cuts across what I was saying, not saying that either of us is wrong or right, just they're different approaches. So you've cut across my approach with a different approach. And so we've discussed my approach, and now you're coming with a different one, saying, okay, let's bring in God existing. Now, if God exists and we assume that at the beginning, or that's our prior, then it changes the balance of the whole thing, doesn't it? And I would agree with David Johnson here that, of course, if we accept the assumption that it's likely that a God exists subjectively of the kind that would want to raise Jesus from the dead, that dramatically tips the balance in favor of resurrection. But that's not what I was talking about, which is how just with documentary evidence we could establish that. And David Russell brought in, okay, God reveals himself. So I would like to, come back on that and say, how would, what would that revelation amount to? That's a different kind of thing, a different kind of evidence altogether. It's a different strand of argument, but it's not what I was talking about.
Okay, so if you're using this formula, I didn't assume it in this overall calculation, but when it comes to the Jeffrey conditionalization formula, which is just meant to calculate this prior probability aspect of it, then this is the formula every PhD mathematician in the world says you would have to follow. This isn't just me assuming Christianity or anything like that. The only thing I've added.
No, but there you see, Dale, you pluck this 50% out of the air, and I don't even see it on the screen, let alone know how you got there.
It's right there.
And the PGB is the probability that God exists. The Christian God exists. That's PGB there. And you're saying that multiplied by another probability, which I think would be fairly high, probability of resurrection, given that God exists. And you're saying that totals at least 50%. But you've given us no calculations or evidence to show how you got that figure.
So that God exists and he has the motivation, not necessarily that he's the Christian God, I'm not assuming that, but that he has the motivation to raise Jesus from the dead. This is what you have to do. Every secular mathematician in the world will calculate that. There's no assumption. On this end, you do the opposite. You have to figure out what this is. I also plugged in 50% because none of the a priori evidential factors, either for or against, right? So, for example, I could point to Richard Swinburne's argument in favor, a priori arguments in favor of Christianity. I didn't find it.
Yeah, certainly you could. Now, all I'm saying is that we can't see it here on the screen. And I think it's worth a show on its own for you to prove the existence of God. Yeah, the kind of God that would raise Jesus from the dead. And if we can get to there, certainly we can get to the resurrection. I would agree as being highly probable. But I can't see any calculation. You pluck numbers out of the air. It's worth looking into, isn't it, to show us how you get there. Maybe there's another presentation you've got that does this. But at the moment, all I can see is the formula. Certainly, the formula appears correct, but you told us that red the red value, the value of the red expression is at least 50%, and you haven't, justified it.
Well, I mean, I wasn't supposed to, but well, in terms of the 50%, so let me just get you to agree on this. So, okay, I get what you're saying. Next show, I will give you a couple of arguments for God's existence and also this additional aspect of why I think it's equally probable for this God to have the motivation to raise Jesus from the dead or to be the Christian, to do Christian miracles or something like that. But 50%, we have to agree on this. And because I got David Johnson to agree, that is the default. It is 50% in terms of Bayesian thing. That's the number you have to plug in for this. For this factor right here.
Where did you get? I asked you before. Sorry, Dave. Where's the 50% come from? And I don't think David Johnson has agreed to it.
He has. We on this show with these slides. He finally understood what I'm saying, right? So. The number one, the default, if you have no evidence one way or another, you would plug in 50% because that equals either the hypothesis is true or the hypothesis is false. Those are the only two options you can have. So that means there's a prior 50% because that's what doesn't affect the calculation.
Yeah. Are we talking about the existence of God here?
Any hypothesis you want. If it's God or resurrection, doesn't matter. But let's say it's God for the sake of argument. Either God exists.
Dale, you really have got to justify this. I mean, supposing that there are 1,000 religions in the world, each with their own different God, and then there's an atheist with no God. So that makes 1,001 different possibilities.
No, that's not how it works.
Principal indifference would tell you that the probability that the Christian God exists is 1 over 1,001, not half.
No, it's half. I'm right. You're wrong because there's either the Christian God is the God is true. God exists is true, or God exists is false. Or with respect to Christian theism is true. That's the hypothesis. 51% to 100% equals yup. It's probably true that the Christian God exists. Anything 49% to 0% equals nope, it's improbable to varying degrees that the Christian God is true.
If there are 1,000 religions, Dale, where do we get Christianity having special treatment?
That's all in the 49% or below. That's all of that's included.
Any Hindu would disagree with you there and say, no, probability that the Hindu gods exist is 50%.
But that's irrelevant because in the falsity, Christian theism is false, includes, Hinduism is true, would count against Christian theism is true. Buddhism, all of that's included in the negation of the truth of the hypothesis. So it is 50%. I know what I'm talking about. I've consulted mathematicians. I've gotten Anthony 66 to agree with me. Please, just believe me. I get that there's thousands of gods.
I'm sorry. We need another show for you to convince me. I do not believe you at all. I'm sorry.
The problem is you're thinking of the odds form. You're saying, well,
I'm not. Nothing to do with the odds form. No. We're talking about how we set up our priors.
Okay, so then I'm right and you're wrong. I get you're saying there's 1,000.
We need a show for you to convince me because I'm not convinced at all.
Okay, all right, we'll do that next time. So let me get out of here.
Right. Look forward to that.
All right. Okay, cool. So that's it. Anything from David Russell or David J on the last front?
No, I mean, I'm good.
Yeah, I'm good. I would say David Kemball-Cook. Every skeptic that has talked to Dale about this has run into the same thing that you've run into, and we've had to take some time to get you to understand how Dale is using it. I did make a good faith effort to do that, and I think that we did come to some agreement, but we didn't come to an agreement that the likelihood of God is 50-50 by any means. So you kind of have to go through all that. Mm-hmm. But I would say that if you did take the time to do that, I think you would, maybe understand where Dale was coming from. I do hate that the discussion got bogged down there though, because there's such richness of possibility.
That's my fault as the host. So I apologize on that front as the host, but yeah, like as David said, I've been this issue is just like a pet peeve, and I'm frustrated of having to the principle of difference. 50% is the prior probability if you have no reason to favor the hypothesis or disfavor, but we'll get into that next time in detail. So yeah, thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll be in touch for the next time.
Okay, thank you.